Welcome to the Herberger Online Office Hours for the summer of 2020. This is where we bring together faculty and instructional designers to talk about specific issues dealing with online course development, instructional design, higher ed, and online course delivery. Today's office hour was recorded on Thursday, May 21st, 2020, and we're talking about the article, 5 Traps That Will Kill Online Learning and Strategies to Avoid Them. I'm Tim McKean, instructional designer at the Herberger Institute of Design and the Arts at Arizona State University. All right, Randy, how about you introduce yourself?
Okay, well, my name is Randy Redman, and I am a professor, assistant professor at St. Louis University, and I teach English for international students. Most of our courses are designed for international students who are going into business programs or some aviation students as well. Mm-hmm. And so we, like a number of people, pivoted online about midway through the semester, and I'm getting ready to teach a fully online summer course starting next week. So this is pretty timely for me.
Mm-hmm. Is this your first time teaching online?
It is, yeah. This was my first, I've taken online courses myself, but I've never actually taught fully online myself.
Great. So I have a link for a document if you want to participate in it. Probably with just the two of us today, it's probably not going to be so necessary, but I'll drop it in the chat room for you anyway. If you have notes you want to add or resources or anything, I find that I like sharing a document rather than just relying on the Zoom chat because it sticks around after we're done. So today we're talking about the article on EdSurge by Rebecca Winthrop on 5 traps that will kill online learning and strategies to avoid them. And you said you had a chance to take a look at that, Randy. What was maybe one of the main things that stood out to you there?
You know, the one that stood out to me was I think the content trap that she mentioned. Mm-hmm. Let me go back in there real quick. Because I find that, you know, talking to myself and some of the other teachers, I think it's really easily to go through, you know, if you taught before and perhaps you had these go-to activities that really worked well for you, or maybe there's some textbook materials that just kind of maybe filled that extra time in a course, that suddenly doesn't really work because it's not really relevant. And I think so it's really a juggling act of trying to figure out what content really works. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes it's just like you start grabbing content without any principled approach. And I found myself kind of struggling with that, looking for kind of an overall design framework to kind of help me manage through that and figure out what content actually should go online. So I felt like that was one that was really salient for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like they say that's you know, that's often where people's first thought is how do I get my content online? And often when we're working with faculty developing a course, they think it's just, well, let me just send you all my content and you'll put it online and then that's it, we're online. And content is definitely a valuable part of the conversation, but there's a lot of teaching technique I find in teaching online, and level setting and finding new ways of communication that support the learning environment that are a whole you know, all separate from the content itself. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people don't know or aren't prepared coming into online teaching. Those kind of classroom management techniques, things that worked for you in the classroom, how do you bring the equivalent? What's the equivalent technique? And I think when I see the content trap and read that section, I'm thinking about the idea that it's not just about the content. That having the right content and having access to the content is surely a big part of it, but there's also a lot of technique that comes involved to teaching online as well.
Definitely.
What were some of your experiences this spring as far as learning to interact with your students in a different way?
You know, I ended up deciding to primarily rely on asynchronous modes of delivery, mostly because when many of my students returned to their home countries, they didn't actually have access to reliable internet connections a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up trying to spend more time designing better asynchronous experiences than synchronous. And I had one or two kind of optional office hours, and that was what I tried to use for kind of that interaction piece, face to face. And some of the more, I would say, some of the more involved students took advantage of that, but a lot of them seemed like they just weren't ready for that sudden transition to, being on video. And so what I did is I ended up recording those Zoom sessions with the students' permission, put those into the, because my office hours often happen at the beginning of the week. So I could put those into the course and then kind of give a little bit of a narration or to what that was about. And then students can kind of seek clarification through this Q&A that I had with other students. And so that was one way that I kind of did synchronous. But for the most part, I ended up trying to include, for me, the big picture, the hardest thing was trying to be really simple, but direct in terms of like an overlay or an outline of what needs to happen each week. And I think like trying to have a good design approach was something that, that I kind of struggled with. And then I felt like I finally hit my stride towards the end, and kind of looking at examples of that. But yeah, I feel like interaction is definitely one that I was struggling with.
Yeah. And I think you came to the right realization pretty fast. And that's great, that the value when moving online is in those asynchronous activities. Learning when to choose an asynchronous activity and when to choose a real-time activity. And then that there are certainly different types of value in each of those modes of interaction. And like you said, students, the asynchronous activities give our students lots more flexibility when it comes to, whatever their schedule is or their location or their ability to connect, whether they have different kinds of internet connections. I taught at a school that had a lot of very rural students. So to do something like what we did this spring with a lot of Zoom calls would have been really hard for them. But they could drive into town and use the Wi-Fi at the library or use the Wi-Fi at the Starbucks or McDonald's to download some things that they needed to, or to post their assignments or stuff like that, then go back home and do their work. And that was actually a workflow, an actual workflow for several of the students that we were working with. And so taking advantage of putting things asynchronous whenever you can really makes it more accessible to the students. And I'm glad that you came to that realization. I think that's the next step for a lot of faculty that did the remote teaching this spring, that kind of relied on their traditional teaching techniques just over a different platform, which was exactly kind of the intention of remote teaching for the spring. But I think that next step is, like you said, looking at some design structures, looking at what can be done asynchronously, and then trying to bring that flexibility. You said you recorded your office hours and then made those available to your students. Did you get any feedback on that?
I did. I did put a little survey into, and I had students do online journals, weekly online journals, where I was asking them questions about like how is the course going for them online. What improvements would they suggest that I make, and so I try to include that as kind of a low stakes, easy way for them to kind of reflect on their learning, but also give me feedback. And some of them said they really liked that because they said for some of them, they had like the 12-hour difference in when my office hours were. So they would be in China and it would be, my office hours were 10 a.m. to 12, and that would be midnight for them.
Right.
And so I did have like one or two scheduled Zoom meetings during that normal time, and they were just like zombies, And so I was like, okay, this isn't really working for you guys. And that's when I started making the optional office hours and trying to be flexible and then just recording them. But that seemed to work well for a number of students, and they said that helped them understand assignment clarifications and things like that. But it kind of it kind of made it so they relied on that one student who was pretty proactive. So
It does. It takes one person at least showing up so that the conversation can happen.
mm-hmm.
And then passing that conversation on to the rest of your class brought them value.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm trying to think of like a better option for that, to where it's like you have to maybe, I think this semester, I'm going to have a set Zoom for the summer term, a set Zoom time,
Mm-hmm.
but it's only like, I think we have it set for once a week in our department. And I'm going to kind of give them the option to make up that time. If they can't make it, then there'll be another makeup time during the week.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what I'm thinking.
I've seen some faculty that have maybe some staggered office hours. So there's one that's in the morning, one that's in the evening throughout the week. And,
Mm-hmm.
and that, again, that kind of expectation, like you said, that you hit one of them, or that you hit, one out of every three, or, have some expectation of, but still allowing that flexibility. And I think that's where a lot of that value is. We can require things, and we can ask students to do things, as long as we're providing flexible options for them, and we're finding that balance between, rather than just, you have to be here at 4 o'clock. But if I provide 3 options for you and ask you to be at one of them, that should be a reasonable amount of flexibility, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that's kind of where I've been trying to figure out what's the right amount of flexibility that where there's choice involved, and it doesn't feel like, all right, you have to be at this time. Because, I think there's a lot of things going on with students that when you take them out of the classroom, that you can't really understand what they're dealing with. And I'm sure you probably notice that in your own online learning,
Right.
So just trying to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you have a lot of international students. You mentioned you have some students specifically in China. What are your thoughts or your plans as far as fall is concerned, when we're hearing that there's a good potential that a lot of international students might not be able to return, even if our campuses are open?
I don't know where we're at so far, but I know your guys' president, I know Michael Crow has been really good about having a number. I heard I think a podcast he was on with the, I want to say it's Freakonomics, where he was talking about ASU's, all the different options, like the high flex and some of those options. So I think we're not set up to deliver, that robust system, but I think we're looking at probably some kind of high flex option for students, so that the students that are on campus can attend classes, and then probably some online, kind of opt-in synchronous.
Right.
I don't quite understand that whole high flex model yet, and I'm still trying to understand, what that might look like. But I think that's what they've been talking about so far.
Well, and the way I've understood high flex in the past, and the kind of the model that like you mentioned, one of the models we're looking at ASU is this high flex. At ASU, we're calling it ASU Sync, but it's essentially the same thing. But it's a way of doing kind of what you've already done, in that you're finding ways to bring the best experience to the students that need different modalities. So if students need an asynchronous option, that's there for them. If students interact better in real time, there's also a real-time option available for them. And then making those recordings or an asynchronous alternative activity available after the fact. So instead of having, in-person classes and online classes and hybrid classes and all these different silos or different kinds of classes, if we can teach one class in a way that kind of serves everybody's need, and also gives them the flexibility to change tracks if they need to, if they prefer to be in person, maybe they're a local Arizona person and they can come to class for, on our campus, then that's available to them. But if something happens and we need to go back online, or something happens and they, their job shift changes and they can't make that time anymore, now they can seamlessly move to the, maybe they can Zoom in for the class sessions, or maybe they can watch the recording afterward and then give a reflection in the Q&A document or something like that. So that's kind of the idea of the high flex, is that we're creating one class environment that uses the best of asynchronous and the best of synchronous together, which for a long time in online, those two have never existed, especially at ASU Online. The assumption is with ASU Online that everything is asynchronous. And there hasn't been an embrace of synchronous activities yet in that environment. So I'm kind of excited that we're finally moving to a time where we can recognize there is a lot of value in synchronous interactions. And you know, one of the traps they talked about here was the isolation trap, and this idea that it's so easy for online students to feel like they're all alone, right? And that they're learning from a computer, or they're learning from a document rather than learning from a person. And I think the synchronous, even if it is just a once a week check-in office hour, or even a video of an office hour, it still brings that personality to the course. It brings the students' personalities if you get to see some of your peers there. That definitely brings the instructor personality, which is a lot of the time greatly missing when we fall for the first trap, which is focusing too much on content.
Yeah, you know, and I think for me, thinking about my summer course and putting stuff online, and especially the synchronous part, is trying to figure out ways to make best use of that, you know, that synchronous block of time, and to where I'm, you know, not wasting students' time, and also, you know, giving time for application of principles, and not, you know, using it for delivering some instruction that could be better done in like a video or something like that. So to me, like, that's one of the big challenges, trying to figure out, you know, how to make best use of that synchronous time.
Yeah, that's definitely the main challenge. And you're right, you've identified a few things already. You know, synchronous time is all about respecting the student's time, right? So if I'm asking them to be at a certain time or a certain place, and all I'm doing is something that I could have done in a video, then that turns them off, right? It kind of shows a bit of disrespect for their time. It's also a poor use of your own time. But things like direct instruction, if you can break out those components of direct instruction and pre-record those, then when you do have a chance to get together, it can really be about interaction. And really, that's what synchronous time is best for students to participate and to be interactive. So a Q&A session, or if you have a lot of students, having them break up into breakup rooms and talk to each other is a great use of synchronous time. We sometimes forget that synchronous time doesn't just have to be about us, but it could be about them talking to each other and getting some feedback. And then, so breakout rooms in Zoom, or having students set up their own venue for talking to each other in synchronous times can be really valuable too. What were your thoughts on this idea of the teaching transfer trap?
Let's see. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of, there's a lot of teachers that I teach with, and I think we feel like we're pretty good at our job. Many of us have been doing it for quite a while, but you know, once you kind of enter the online environment, like, even if you had a great lesson, I think you kind of have to completely change your mindset in terms of how you approach things, and then the tools available, how to make good use of those tools. And then, like, how do you connect with the learning objectives and the learning outcomes with the tools you're using? I think that's one thing that I've been trying to suggest my colleagues, like, really focus on that before they start moving into deciding what tools, and I'm trying to do that myself. And so I think, you know, the old tricks that you had, or methods of approaching teaching content, just have to be completely reimagined. And I think that's where the transfer trap kind of comes into, is if you think that you can just get away with what worked before.
Right. And for anyone that hasn't looked at the article yet, the teaching transfer trap is this idea that, kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion, that the techniques that you knew before, or some of the approaches that you may have used before and have worked for you before, might not still be as appropriate in the online environment, or in this article's case, in the virtual environment. And so that idea that this is a new thing, and I think that's freeing for faculty to, when I tell them that sometimes, this is a new skill. If you're struggling with remote teaching, that's okay. That's perfectly normal. none of us were ever trained to teach that way. And remote teaching until March was never really a thing anyway. Even those that were running HiFlex and those that were doing high quality online teaching, that neither of those models actually looked like what happened in March and April of this month. That idea that we would continue teaching the way we were, but just through a virtual environment, is hard. It's really hard. It's hard for us. It's hard for students. It's hard to learn to be on camera and how to manage that and just kind of be comfortable with that. Anyone that's done any kind of recording knows that it takes a while to get used to hearing your own voice, you know, through a headset, through a microphone. Being on camera is a skill, and just interacting with people that you can't actually see. That's hard for a lot of faculty that are recording lectures for the first time. They're just, you know, it's different to talk to a camera than it is to talk to people, and just getting comfortable with that. And so I think acknowledging that those are completely different skills, and acknowledging that if you're struggling with it and if it's frustrating to you, that's not a personal fault on you at all. You're being asked to do a whole new thing, and probably a thing that you've never been trained for.
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, I feel like I had a little bit of background in that, taking some online teaching courses before, but still, I mean, even with that experience, I still felt like I was challenged quite a bit by it.
What were some of the, can you think of some of the techniques that you realized weren't working for you?
Let's see, I taught 2 writing courses, and those courses were difficult in terms of managing feedback online. And, you know, when you meet in a class regularly, you can kind of see the writing process take place when students are working on essays and a piece of writing. And so, like, I realized that, you know, the normal check-in activities and things I would do in class, when you had them spread out, you couldn't monitor students' progress. And so I felt like I just didn't have enough interspace activities happening online to really guide students through the writing process to where they would be successful and meet the learning outcomes. And so that was one of the things that was like, well, yeah, when I'm face to face, we do this activity and then we do this. And it was really hard to kind of figure out what that looked like online.
So did you find you had to break it up into more pieces, or just different pieces?
I feel like it was more pieces and different. You know, I started trying to figure out ways to be creative with the discussion boards to where they could give feedback on each other's writings. But one of the challenges of that, a lot of students were not used to using discussion boards in that way. And so I felt like I was teaching them the technology and then also teaching them how to use it at the same time. So it was like, there was kind of like 2 levels to the learning curve there that made it kind of difficult.
I think that's pretty common, especially as we get instructors who are being innovative and trying to use tools in new ways, that it is pretty common, and probably not something we're ever going to get beyond, of you have to teach the tool, you know, and the content that you're showing through the tool, right? And every time that you have a new tool or a new technique, part of an online course development is, here's how this course works. And especially if your course is going to be different than the course they took from your colleague or the course that they took last term, then a big part of that orientation or getting started module is often about, here's how this course works. We use these tools. Here's how these tools work. Here's where you get support for these tools if you haven't used them before. And there's a lot of that meta teaching that you have to provide support for the environment, just so they can get to the content that you actually wanted to teach in the first place.
Definitely. Yeah. And that was one of the things I think, like, when I realized that there were all these barriers that students had, I was like, well, I still need to use the technology, but I feel like I was limited in the remote teaching situation because I couldn't kind of go back to square one and start from the beginning and scaffold the technology instruction to where it was like, okay, we use this tool, let's say it's VoiceThread in a discussion forum type post, and they introduce themselves, and then we continue to use it. So you couldn't really do that if there's like a couple weeks of the course left, and it's like, all right, well,
Right.
So I felt like one of the things that I had done successfully was kind of a little bit of a flipped or hybrid model where I was using the LMS already and kind of setting up weekly modules that told them what we were going to be doing in the face-to-face class. So that is something that I think I kind of learned from the experience that I'll keep doing,
So you were already doing some flipped model?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so especially with the writing courses, I kind of had them we use OneDrive, and so we were using kind of like Google Docs, but we had a lot of that online where they were giving peer feedback and adding comments to each other's drafts, and then coming to class and discussing some of those, or I would do that and give feedback on their drafts, and then we'd have face-to-face conferences. So I think that was one thing that I could continue to use because I already been using it, and I didn't have to completely reteach it.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like you were already on a good foothold to make the pivot to completely online because of the stuff that you had been doing already using the LMS and doing some of those flipped techniques.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there was people inside of our not in our department specifically, but in our university that we kind of heard about who were pushing back and not even wanting to use LMS or hadn't used LMS, and suddenly they're trying to use different things. So that was trying to make sure that everybody was on the same page and trying to use the LMS so there was some continuity was kind of one of the things that we were trying to struggle with and get everybody be on the same page.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you can kind of internalize if the struggles that you felt, even already being partially prepared and already partially online, you can imagine those instructors that have only taught in person, maybe haven't used the LMS at all, or haven't used, online gradebook or any kind of online course repository or things like that. I can only imagine. I supported some and worked with several, but just that sudden reorientation that they needed to a completely different mindset of teaching.
Yeah, I'm curious, like how do you scaffold that as somebody who's an instructional designer, scaffold that learning experience for faculty, to
when I've got time,
building.
then what I do is one thing, but what we had to do here was with no time, right? And I don't know how it worked out for you guys. We made the announcement over spring break. So faculty weren't even on campus, they weren't even around, or students weren't around. So they left for spring break, not knowing that they wouldn't come back. And so, yeah, very little time. We've made a lot of webinars available. I know that our university technology office started offering Zoom webinars kind of back-to-back nonstop. And they were getting hundreds of faculty at a time attending those, which was great. Just to get that, once that platform was established and once faculty were able to reach to their students, then they could slowly work out all the rest. Right. But making that initial contact was a huge struggle or a huge leap. And I think our university did a pretty good job of that. There were some ramifications moving forward. But I think when I have time, I like to bring people along the pathway that you've already described. That if they're teaching in person, that the first thing to learn is to start to use the LMS, maybe get your assignments in there and start using the online gradebook. And then maybe post some reading assignments. So you're starting to use it as a repository, all in an effort to support your in-person class. And then maybe you start using course announcements and the inbox tools and things like that. And then gradually, once they see the value of that, then they can start a flipped approach where, hey, instead of you coming to me to lecture, I can post a video here for you. And then when you come to class, now we can have discussion. We can work on drafting the first, we can actually work on a writing assignment, or, we can make better use of the class time because I've already delivered the instruction to you And so we move from just supporting an in-person class into a flipped model. And then we can start moving into a hybrid model where maybe some of the class time is now taken online, where we front load some discussions or do some quizzes or other things like that. So we have less class time. And again, just with the intention that we continue to heighten the value of that synchronous time. If I'm asking students to come to campus, it must be for a really good reason. And it must be something that I can't do asynchronously. Otherwise, why am I asking them to drive or to leave work or to find a babysitter or, you know, all the things that has to happen for the modern student to come to class. And so that's kind of a progression that I like to bring faculty along of, you know, let's look at where you are and here's maybe the next step. One more thing. A lot of the times I learned this phrase in connection to accessibility, but I found that it applies really well in lots of situations, but this idea of a +1 approach. What's one thing I can add to my course this term that's going to make it better than this term? And if I keep thinking that +1 mentality, eventually I find my course is fantastic because over, you know, 10 terms, I've added all these things or I've changed these techniques. Where if I asked an instructor, if I gave him a list and said, hey, change these 10 things, it would just be overwhelming and it would be scary. It would be, these are way too many things for me to learn. But when I say, hey, what do you think about this one thing? That's often much more doable. And then they come to the next thing on their own a lot of the time too. I like that you brought up the idea of learning objectives. And I think that focusing on learning objectives or coming back to your learning objectives addresses multiple of these traps. It addresses the teaching transfer trap, but it also addresses the content trap as well. This idea that things you used and techniques you used before might not be appropriate or might not work anymore. But if we come back to the learning objective, then we can find things that do work and meet the same need. And I think that's something that takes a while for some faculty to come to, is just because we're not doing the same activity or the same assignment doesn't mean we can't achieve the same goals. And if you have a good sense of what your instructional goals were to start with, why you chose that assignment or why you chose that activity, then once you get comfortable with the online environment, you can figure out new things that meet that same objective. But it does, I think, take some time getting comfortable and being aware of what's available in your LMS or what other kind of interactive tools you have available. You mentioned, I think, Flipgrid. You know, you have to know what the tools are and what they do before you can start making the connections of, oh, I can use this tool to meet this objective.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things that right now, as I prepare next week, starting my summer course, is just looking at, I kind of use a grid where I'm looking at the learning outcomes and then kind of the backward design approach. And it's time consuming. And, you know, I hadn't actually sat down and planned it, mapped out a course like that, but I'm sure you work with faculty and do that kind of sometimes too, where it's just like, all right, well, what are all your outcomes? And then what are the activities and the assessments that go with those? And so then, you know, those other assessments that I would have face to face, I had to kind of rethink. I was like, well, how can I use the LMS or some of these tools to make this assessment more meaningful? And not only that, but maybe hit other learning outcomes at the same time. And so having that mapped out was really helpful, because I was like, well, I could hit this learning outcome if I do this, but if I don't do this activity, you know, it kind of helped my decision-making process a little more. But it was intimidating at first when I'd never sat down and kind of done that full.
That's a good word for that. It's intimidating, but when it's done, it's freeing. I think it takes a lot of stress off, because a lot of faculty have, and I was the same way when I first started teaching, this idea of fake it till you make it, or just kind of making it up as you go. And we get used to that when we're teaching on ground. We know what our course is about. We know in general kind of what we're going to do. We show up week 1, see how it goes, see what we're ready for week 2, or the next day, or that kind of thing. When I first started teaching a brand new teacher, I was a middle school teacher, and it was like that. It was like, I need to stay 2 or 3 days ahead of these students. and that's all, you know, but it also adds that extra stress of I'm constantly now developing the course at the same time as teaching the course.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that when we move online and then when you get comfortable with this, it applies to your in-person course as well. But when you've got the course really well designed and you've thought through it and you know exactly what activity meets what need, and you know how things need to be scaffolded so that they've learned something, they've had a chance to practice something, they've had a chance to get some feedback, they've got some kind of self-assessment, and then, you know, a formal assessment, and you've got that all structured. All of a sudden teaching is a lot easier as far as the delivery, and I think more fun, because now it's all about interacting with your students. You're not also trying to write and design and again stay those 2 or 3 steps ahead of them, because you're already at the end. You're already done being prepared.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the approach that, you know, the kind of fake it as you make it, learn as you go, kind of, that a lot of us probably got used to. And I think teaching online, from what I've seen, takes a lot more planning to do it well. And I think that's the part where it's just like, if you weren't a planner before, now you need to be.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Online is harder. Online is harder for us. Online is harder for students, especially. And for anyone that hasn't taken an online course, it might be wise to go sign up for something in the Canvas community or one of your kind of open online course opportunities, or see if your school has a professional development online program that you can take and just kind of get that experience of what it is like to be an online student. Because as we talked about earlier, one of the things that is more difficult online is communication. In class, in person, if something you say isn't clear enough, or a student wasn't paying attention or missed some information, it's easy for them to raise their hand and ask, or turn to their peer and ask. But in an online course, they've got to go through a channel. They've got to go through some process to get information from you, and that's going to take more time, and they have to know what that process is. And so just even every small communication is much more difficult. And, you know, so that's one of the reasons that you're right, that you realize that the online format does require more planning. It requires that things make more sense the first time. It requires that all the information is kind of in place or findable for your students, so they don't have these panic moments and this isolation feeling. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that isolation is one thing that, you know, I know my students commented on that, because I had them submit journals all through the course once we went online, and a lot of them mentioned just feeling, you know, isolated, and just like that they didn't have that connection, and so that was one thing that I was like, why I used journals was just trying to have that connection, although it turned out to be a lot of work for me. And so once I started that, I was like trying to respond those into a timely manner, but it was great for getting feedback. But that was one thing that they all mentioned, was just not all of them, but majority of them, that they felt kind of isolated.
Yeah. Did you have them submit their journals in a way that that they could see each other's journals, or was it mostly just submitted to you?
It was submitted to me through Blackboard. That's our LMS. And I thought there was an option in there to make it so it was viewable, but even though I don't think I quite figured out how that worked correctly. So that's one of the revisions that I've been talking with my colleagues that we're planning for this summer, is to actually have our journals, you know, shared amongst the students, and just like it'll be in the shared OneDrive space that all the students can see. And and some of the other teachers are having them that we teach the same group of students. So we're trying to make sure we're not being redundant in the assignments, but that other teachers can see those too, and they're shareable.
Yeah, I like sometimes to use a discussion board that way. So you use the discussion board as the infrastructure, but just use it as a way of posting your journal. So, but using something like a digital portfolio, or maybe it's a document that they're just adding new entries to every time, and then just post a link into the discussion board. But that is one of those, and kind of leading to the last trap here is the learning is serious trap, is what they call it in the article.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in higher ed, maybe that's not quite always the issue. I think learning is always serious,
Yep.
hopefully not too serious. But one of the things that I drew from that, or the connection I made to that, is this idea that learning is impersonal, and that there still needs to be people involved. Even, you know, we're not learning from the computer, we're learning through the computer. And there's still people on the other end. And so that's why I like that idea of the journals and having them shared kind of publicly, or getting those peer responses to their journal entries. It creates that sense. One book I read was about instructor presence, and it was all about creating the sense that we are together in this class, right? You're not isolated, and it's not just about me and the student, but it's about that the students are together as well. And when they start submitting those journal entries, and they're seeing that, oh, their peer is struggling with this same kind of thing, or having a course Q&A board or something like that, there's a lot of camaraderie that happens, or just what's the word, effication, the idea that others are struggling too, just helps you feel better with your struggle. And you know, if you see that all the students are struggling, then all of a sudden you're dealing with, you know, you're exactly the same as them. You know, you're not feeling like, oh, they're doing great and I'm doing badly, I don't know what's happening. And that's very common in online, is that we assume that if we're struggling, we're the only one, because, you know, why isn't everyone else struggling? So I like that idea of the journals for sure.
Yeah, I like the idea of trying to make them, implement them in the discussion board too. So that, I think that's something that I hadn't thought of before.
And if you make that more about the peer interaction, then that takes some of the pressure off you to be the one giving all the feedback to every journal entry.
Right.
And that, as you said, that is a lot of work, and that is something that we have to think about as we try to create these online interactions and these high quality assessments and all these things to bring a good instructional educational experience to our students. The deeper any activity is, the more work it takes to grade it and give feedback and things like that. So keeping those in mind of how can I provide a good balance of things that are sustainable, and feedback only matters if it's timely, right? If I tell my students to have their journals due on Friday, and then I don't get around until grading them until the next Thursday, then that feedback is kind of already, that's water under the bridge. That's, you know, that's not really relevant, because they're already working on writing their next thing or reading the next chapter. So timely feedback is huge. And if they can get more timely feedback from their peer than from you, then sometimes that can actually be of more value than something that is feedback from the instructor and graded and things like that.
Definitely. Yeah, that was definitely one of my takeaways on learning lessons, and trying to have 2 classes do journals and trying to respond to them. I was like, yeah, I didn't really factor that in. I was just like, well, this is a good way to keep up that interaction, instructor presence. And I didn't actually take into account the workload on myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm you know, as I'm saying this, warning lights are going off in my head of, you know, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be giving feedback or be involved. Right. You know, oftentimes we get faculty that just want everything to be auto graded, or, you know, could be completely hands off. And I don't like that either, but definitely finding that balance of touching in. And it's interesting that the research, even in discussion boards, often supports that idea that that a faculty can be too involved, that if if the instructor is too involved in the discussion board, then it kind of stifles the peer-to-peer interactions, because it establishes that feeling that there's right and wrong answers, and that, you know, I can't say anything, the instructor will tell me if I'm right or not, you know. And so there's always this little balance of this massaging of I'm present and I'm giving some feedback, but I'm not overpowering the conversation as well.
Yeah, I think that's that Goldilocks, you know, approach that is kind of hard to attain. I think sometimes, especially if you're not really used to using discussion boards and trying to figure out what that fine line is. And I'd imagine it probably changes depending on what type of, you know, what type of assignment you're using the discussion board for, and like your overall learning outcomes for it.
Yep. So you mentioned a few things, and we talked about the +1 approach. What are you excited about for summer to try differently?
Let's see. I think one of the things that a lot of, I think pretty much all the faculty I'm working with, we're all using the same course template.
Mm-hmm.
So that, our instructional design team put out. So I'm excited that we'll have continuity because I think that was one of the big things that many students were kind of struggling with, was just feeling like they would go into one course and it was like, I don't know where to begin. And then other courses where everybody's different. So that's one thing that I'm pretty excited about. I have a pretty small class that I'm teaching, and I'm kind of excited about seeing how I can use that synchronous time really effectively to, whether it's doing peer review activities and kind of guiding them to, through the writing process. And so I'm trying to I think that's the kind of the part that I'm going to have to figure out, is trying to how to use that most effectively. Because I feel like I can put together a pretty good asynchronous experience, but the synchronous part is what I'm looking forward to, the challenge and seeing what I can do with that.
Great. Yeah, that is the magic answer, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Choosing what things have the best value asynchronously and what things have the best value synchronously, and how to pull them off in the right balance.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is just trying to think about the learners that I have, and like kind of making sure that I'm giving chances for them to give frequent feedback on what's working and what's not up front. And so not being too tied to some idea on something, and just giving some flexibility in my course where it can change and adapt. But obviously having kind of plans in place, but I think trying to figure out what that flexibility is going to look like is kind of a challenge too.
Yeah. And I like that idea of student feedback throughout a course. We often wait too long and just rely on, course evaluations, which often don't address good questions of course design anyway. Mm-hmm. But if we can, check in with our students at the end of week 2, or at the end of the, depending on your term, but like, a quarter of the way in, and then again at the 2/3 mark, and just see how they're doing. And that's another one of those things of providing that flexibility, but also that level of student respect, that, hey, I'm respecting your experience, and I'm wanting you to have a good experience. So tell me if something isn't working, so that we can work on it together. Hey, Randy, thanks for joining us for the office hour this week.
Oh yeah, well, thanks for hosting this, Tim. I learned a lot from it, and I feel like I always learn quite a bit from things you post in the group. So I appreciate that as well.
Excellent.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to maybe attending next week.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll talk to you later.
All right. We'll see you then.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thanks for joining us for the Herberger Online Office Hour. I hope you'll consider joining us in real time sometime. We record over Zoom every Thursday afternoon at 1 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time or Mountain Standard Time. The link for the Zoom meeting will be in the description of the video or on the podcast feed, wherever you're finding this Facebook group. I posted it several different places. If you can't find it, send me an email at timothy.mckeen@asu.edu, and I'll get that over to you. Also, if you have any suggestions or an article, video, or podcast that you'd like to see the group discuss, we're happy to take some requests, some suggestions. So I hope you'll consider participating in that way. Leave comments below or wherever you're seeing or hearing this, and we'll talk to you again in the future. Thanks.